Hello everyone. Welcome to the Hearts and Hands Quilt Guild 2021 Virtual Quilt Show, Bed Turning. We want to express our thanks to the St. Clair County Historical Society of Belleville, Illinois, for the opportunity to share these antique quilts with you. And a special thank you to Mr. Will Shannon, the curator of the Society, for all of his help and the courtesies extended to us in presenting these wonderful examples of quilts from our past. My name is Sharon Morfick, and I will be your narrator today. Assisting me will be Miss Millie Perrine and Mr. Harl Jones, and our videographer is Miss Nancy Eisenhower. What is a bed turning? A bed turning is a way of introducing quilters and non-quilters to the beauty of antique or unique quilts. Quilts have a long history of not only being used for warmth, but are also considered a form of art. They are a pictorial history of the lives and experiences as told from the quilters themselves. In the pioneer or olden days, the ladies would work on their quilts by hand during the cold winter nights and would want to show off their creations. They would invite ladies in town to their home, and since there were no large areas in their cabins in which to display their quilts, they just used the most logical place, their bed. They would then share their stories about the quilts and the experience of making them, turning each of them over to display the next one. Popular patterns for quilts during this period included some of the favorites we see today: log cabin, Dresden plate, double wedding ring, grandmother's fan, and an occasional crazy quilt, hand-embellished with ribbons, embroidery, jewelry, and more. We don't have the privilege of having the makers of these quilts with us to share their experiences, but we do have some information about each of these beautiful pieces of art. So let's begin. Our first three quilts were donated to the Society by Miss Linda Casson of Belleville, Illinois in 2008. She indicated they were made by her mother, Miss Emma Bertha Schmidt Dragon. The first one is an Irish chain, a quilt made from federal blue and white fabrics. Irish chain pattern was developed in America in the early 1800s, and many have been made over the years, indicating the designs. The second of Miss Dragon's quilts is known as Grandma's Flower Garden. This pieced hexagon quilt had roots in England as far back as the 18th century. Immigrants soon brought this pattern to America. Hexagon templates for these quilts have been found that were made around 1770. This leads historians to believe that the hexagon pattern might be one of the oldest pieced patterns. It was a very popular quilt made during the 1920s. And the third of Miss Dragon's quilts is the yo-yo quilt. Fabric yo-yos became popular in quilt making during the 1920s. Fabrics were sewn together to mimic quilt patterns or to make pictorial designs. Large projects were sometimes made with as many as 10,000 tiny yo-yos. We're unsure of the number used in this quilt, but there are over 3,300. Our next quilt is known as a Crazy Patch Friendship Quilt. It was donated by Helen Hoff of Belleville in 1984. The description reads, quote, "A group of women made patches, notice various initials on patches, later met to set them together and presented the quilt to someone special," unquote. There is a prominent monogram in one of the blocks that indicates EJR. The Crazy Quilt is probably the oldest of quilt patterns. Crazy quilts had their heyday in the late 1800s following Philadelphia's 1876 Centennial Exposition, where the Japanese pavilion featured asymmetrical fractured designs and various images of birds, fans, and flowers. The Victorian ladies wanted to replicate the artwork and began making quilts with erratic, jumbled, mixed fabrics, stitches, and embroidered images, all considered planned artwork. Early quilters used any scrap or remnant available, regardless of its color, design, or fabric type. Worn-out clothing, women's calico dresses, men's pants and shirts, household linens, and other oddly shaped fabric scraps were fitted and stitched together. The result was a hodgepodge of color and a quilt with a story behind each scrap. Next, we have a children's alphabet quilt. This quilt has the name Charlotte and 1916 embroidered in its center. The quilt was made for Charlotte Noble of Belleville and donated in 1990 by Mrs. Otis Guyman. We know Charlotte was the recipient, but it is unknown if the quilt was made in 1916 or if that was her birth year. The quilt is made up of white snowball blocks with the addition of sashing, creating a secondary shoe-fly block in red. All of the alphabet letters and characters are embroidered in red thread. Our next three quilts originated from the Abend family of Belleville and were donated to the Society by Mrs. Linda Sinclair of Denver, Colorado in 2009. The first is a rose applique quilt. One of the oldest applique quilt patterns is the Rose of Sharon. The Rose of Sharon, mentioned in the Bible, might actually refer to a wild tulip that grows today on the plains of Sharon in Palestine. When the Bible was translated into English, the word rose was used in place of the word tulip. The flower petals on this quilt were gathered before appliquing them, and the quilt was densely hand quilted. The next quilt is known as Ocean Wave, done in blue and white fabrics, predominantly using half-square triangles. The pattern initially appeared in about 1855 and was very popular from 1880 to 1920. It was first published by Farm and Fireside in 1894 as Ocean Waves, which has remained the most common name for the block. Through the years, the pattern gained in popularity. Many Midwestern quilters made Ocean Waves quilts, and pioneers took them along on their westward journeys. Our next quilt is described as blue and white quilt. However, it is multicolored in soft pastels with a blue border, using the style of the antique 1929 Old Mill Wheel block, which is a variation of the Drunkard's Path block. Each block is a scalloped square with 4 quarter circles forming blocks and corners which have been appliqued. Our next quilt is probably the oldest quilt we have to present to you today. It's entitled Satin Brown Quilt, donated in 1984 by Mrs. Walter Lisi. This quilt was made around 1880, making it 141 years old. The quilt is made with numerous square in a square blocks, all in satins, and set medallion style using brown satin as the focus fabric. The next quilt is entitled Blue and Pink Quilt with Blue Border. The donor and maker are unknown. It was donated to the Society in 2007. The blocks used are pinwheel and hourglass blocks in various fabrics that look to be feed sack fabrics, but is one piece of printed fabric known as cheater cloth. At the beginning of the 19th century, manufacturers of flour, sugar, rice, grain, and feed used cotton to make bags for packaging their products, and women would save them and use them for various sewing projects, including bed coverings. The feed sacks were sold in colors, and around 1925, colorful prints for making dresses, aprons, shirts, and children's clothing began to appear in stores. By the late 1930s, there was heated competition to produce the most attractive and desirable prints. And our last item today is a 105-year-old quilt labeled Friendship Quilt from St. Mary's School in Belleville, Illinois in 1915. It contains a block embroidered worked by pupils in 1914 and 1915. Each white block is hand embroidered with the names of clergy, laity, families, students, and teachers of St. Mary's Catholic School in Belleville. It was donated to the Society by Connie Broadhurst in memory of Irene and Ben Reeson. That concludes our bed turning today. For those of you who are quilters who have joined us today, we would like to stress that you include a label on each quilt you make. Somewhere, at some future time, there will be admirers of your creative endeavors who will want to know the history behind the artwork that you have so lovingly created. We want to thank you for joining us today. We wish to again thank the St. Clair County Historical Society and Mr. Will Shannon for all their help.